Hey, before we dive into this week's episode, if you've been enjoying the show, I'd love your support. Take just 10 seconds to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps others discover the wisdom and inspiration that I share on the Pivot to Balance podcast. Let's build a community of balance seekers together. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to share the love. Now let's dive into the episode. Hello and welcome to the Pivot to Balance podcast. I'm your host, AK, and I hope you're doing well. In a world that pulls us in a million different directions and with a billion distractions, finding balance can feel like an ambiguous quest. Join me on this podcast as I try to navigate life's twists and turns with mindfulness, purpose, and grace. In each episode, we will dive into topics like self-care, personal growth, mindset shifts by sharing practical insights, stories, and maybe even interviews. Get ready to pivot, to recalibrate, and find your balance. Follow the Pivot to Balance podcast, and I will see you on the other side. Welcome back to this week's episode. I actually want to talk about something that's been on my mind lately, and you might have seen me talk about this across platforms. How can we find balance between having multiple passions and staying productive? And how can we focus deeply on one thing at a time? I mean, if you actually listen to this again, you'd be like, multiple passions, but also being productive, but also focusing on one thing at a time. What are you talking about? Okay. I've always been someone with a lot of interests, and honestly, that's what brings me happiness. Pursuing multiple things keeps me excited and engaged, whether it's podcasting, editing, filming, or my day job. But the key here is when I'm working on any of those things, I am all in. Like, I'm all in. I might have many interests, but I don't divide my attention in the moment, and that's where deep work comes in. I actually want to talk about what I learned and a little bit of story time. And then we'll talk about deep work a little bit. We'll talk about multiple different things, okay? Like my inspiration stuff. So let's start with one thing. Why do we tend to fall into like this trap of being busy? People love to say that they're busy. So I've also been that person before. So I kind of did a little bit of research, like just ChatGPT, asking Google a little bit question, doing some self-discovery. And I learned that our brains actually get a little reward each time we cross something off the to-do list. You could basically just add, wake up today to your to-do list, cross it off, and feel like, woohoo, I did it. Because it gives us a quick sense of satisfaction, even if it's a small task. But you waking up is a great thing. Grateful for that. But there's a difference between doing something, like quote unquote doing something, and making meaningful progress. When we're constantly busy, it can feel like we're being productive. You can watch a TED Talk and tell yourself that you're being productive. You can listen to this podcast and tell yourself you're being productive. But if it's just the activity for activity's sake, you might need to rethink this. I did tell you that there's a little story. So recently, I've been noticing that I just say yes to everything. I cram my schedule with back-to-back tasks. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel very productive when I do things like that. But deep down, I wasn't really getting or moving closer to what actually mattered to me. And I realized that although I love having multiple interests, I had to be intentional about each one, showing up fully rather than jumping from one task to another. So that was my pivot moment. I started asking myself, great, if I'm going to do videos, why am I doing this? I'm not saying that you need to have a goal, but you need to have a reason, like just something that connects to one of your values. How does it connect to my bigger goals? For example, let's say, what is my bigger goal and why am I doing videos? Is there a connect between the two? Yeah, there is. So when I'm working on something, whether it's editing or creating content, I don't multitask, but I give each one of those things my full focus. I mean, I've talked about multitasking on this podcast and probably anywhere I've talked so many times because I do not believe in multitasking. You cannot work on two different things with the same level of commitment because cognitive overload will not let you do that. Or at least that's how it's been for me. Hey, if you listen to this podcast, I think you will also love my newsletter, Elevate Gazette. I talk a lot about elevating your professional and your personal lives. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter. Go to anushakanan.com/email list, and I'm sure you will love it. Join everyone who is like-minded. And now let's get into the episode. So one thing that has really helped me is the idea of deep work. And I learned about this when I read the book Deep Work by Cal Newport, which is essentially, it talks about going all in on a single high-impact task. Our minds work best when we focus deeply on one thing without jumping around. It almost feels like exercising a muscle. If you work on building that focus, you'll find the quality of work and your creativity actually improves. Imagine if I did a whole ass podcast about being balanced, pivot to balance, do this and that, and then I'm just like all over the place all the time, burnt out. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's very human of us to get burnt out, but it's a balance of having many interests, but approaching each with full presence. That is what matters to me. So yeah, I still love pursuing multiple things, but like I said, I'm fully present with each one rather than trying to do all of them all at once. One example, and I look up to this person because he also has a lot of different interests, and it's Elon Musk. Whether or not you agree with his methods, he has an almost obsessive focus on single problems, and he dives deeply into them. He doesn't fill his time with distractions. He tackles high-impact goals with purpose. There's a lot we can learn from that. Even if we have multiple passions, focus on one at a time to give each its due. I basically just read something I wrote down on my notes app, so if it sounded a little weird, it's because I just wrote it down. So what do you take away from this episode? A very short episode at that one. First of all, ask yourself why. Before you start working on something, ask if it truly aligns with your bigger goals. If not, I'm not saying it's not worth it, but do you really need that candy so badly that you have to leave your desk, go outside and get it? Or is it just a distraction? Secondly, create dedicated focus blocks. Even if you're balancing multiple things, make sure you have time blocks for each one. During those times, mute notifications, close other tabs, go deep into that one thing. When I'm reading a book, it's very easy for me to be like, oh my God, how's my video performing? Can I go check it? Did someone like the video? It's so easy to do that, right? What I do is I take my phone and keep it in the bathroom. The chances of me getting up and going to the bathroom unnecessarily is like way low. It's disgusting, but I still do it. I keep my phone in the bathroom because there's no way I'm getting up to go to the bathroom unless I, really need to be going to the bathroom. The third thing is the most powerful thing, which is the power of saying no. Because every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. The only way you focus is by saying yes to what actually is your priority, saying yes to what is actually something you have to be doing or you get to do. See, it's very easy to feel like you're making progress, right? Like being busy makes you feel like, oh my God, I was so busy today. But were you actually making progress? The feeling of making progress versus actually making progress, by which I mean being intentional, completely two different things. And this isn't something you can change overnight, right? But there is something transformative, like honestly, just the most best feeling about moving from busyness to being intentional. There's a sense of satisfaction that comes from knowing you're working on what truly matters to you, even if you have multiple goals in play. And to be honest, it feels different, more grounded, more fulfilling. It's what's been working for me, but I would obviously love to hear from you. Do you find yourself like working on tasks that don't really mean anything to you? Or do you find yourself pulled in too many directions? How do you stay focused and balanced with multiple interests? I honestly want to know. Let me know. Drop a message on Instagram or leave a comment if you're listening. I mean, I think you can even comment on Spotify, so drop a comment. But yeah, that's what I had for this episode. This is a very emotional episode, so I'm going to actually go get myself a cup of lemon water. You should too. Just ending this episode by saying being productive does not mean doing everything. It means being intentional with each thing. Okay, until next week. Bye.